Section D, Victim Services, Legal Services. So you would complete this section if rural program funded staff provided victim services and or legal services, or if grant funds were used to support victim services and or legal services during the current reporting period. So this section is broken down into two sections. The first one is victim services, and the second one is legal services. If you are providing legal assistance with your rural program funds, you will report victims and demographic information in questions 29 through 35 as appropriate in the victim services section. I also want to note you will also fill out question 36A as well if the victims received other victim services that were not legal assistance, as long as those services were funded with rural program funds. You will then need to fill out the legal services subsection, but with only information related to the victims' survivors who received those specific legal services that you were funded to provide. Most of the data requested in the victim services section is congressionally mandated. Congress wants to know how many of the number of victim survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. This section is structured to collect data in accordance with the congressional mandate. Provide information in this section that represents only those victim survivors who were served and services provided with rural program funds. Please review this section carefully, as some questions in the section may seem counterintuitive. Remember that you can always contact the VAWA MEI team if you have any questions regarding how to report data on the form. We here at VAWA MEI understand that these forms are not straightforward and can be rather confusing. We are happy to walk through any part of the form with you. Also remember that there is a separate instructions document that can be used as a resource and provide additional examples to you. And before we jump into this section, let's first talk about how to determine if a victim is to be reported at all in this section. So first, the victim survivor has to request or accept services before you would report them in this section. It is critical to remember that if a victim survivor does not request or accept services, they should not be reported in this section. So next, think to yourself, are the services they are requesting funded under your rural grant? So two things to consider here. One, you are only going to report on the grant-funded services you provide, not services you provide with other funding. Two, you will only report on the grant-funded services requested by the victim. So do not report a victim who only asks for services that are not grant-funded. If your program provides a victim survivor with a mix of grant-funded and non-grant-funded services, do not report on your program's ability to provide the non-grant-funded services. You should only report on the ability of your program to provide grant-funded services. And then finally, the victim survivor must be a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse to be served with grant funds. If a victim survivor would not be reported in this section if that victim survivor is seeking only services that are not funded with your rural program grant, if they did not accept any of the grant-funded services that were offered or recommended, and if they are not a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse. So the first question in the victim services section is question number 29. Number of victim survivors served, partially served, and victim survivors seeking services who were not served. This question relates essentially to all of the other questions in the victim services section. So essentially, this is the breakdown when determining if a victim survivor has been served, partially served, or not served. You would report a victim as served if they requested grant-funded services and your program was able to provide all of those services. You would report a victim as partially served if they requested grant-funded services, but because of programmatic issues such as those listed in question 33, which I will get to shortly, your program could not provide all of the services requested. You would report a victim as not served if your program could not provide any of the grant-funded services the victim requested due to programmatic issues such as those listed in question 33. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to talk about partially served and not served victim survivors. We find that grantees are often worried about reporting victims as partially served or not served because they fear it will appear that they are not meeting their goals and objectives, or it will shed a negative light on their program. However, by reporting victims partially served or not served, grantees are helping OVW and decision policymakers understand the scope and burden of violence that stretches far beyond what VAWA is able to fund. OVW knows that VAWA funding is not enough to support every victim who requests services from grantees. Therefore, we want to encourage you to carefully track and report using both the quantitative data and the narrative data to highlight instances of partial or non-service. Narrative data can highlight long waiting lists for services, full emergency shelters, or programs' inability to support victims on family court days. Your more detailed data can help show the great need for services that exist. So this is some additional more information about how to report in question 29. You may only count the victim once during each reporting period in question 29. If an individual victim requests services more than once during a reporting period, they would only be counted once, even if served multiple times. So in this question, you are counting people and not services. However, please be sure to report victims and survivors in each reporting period they request services. So for example, in the previous reporting period, a victim requested civil legal advocacy. Your program provided that service and continues providing that service if the current reporting during the current reporting period. You would count this victim in both the previous reporting period and the current reporting period. You will also need to determine if a victim should be counted as a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, or child sexual abuse. Since you may only count a victim once during each reporting period, if a victim experienced more than one type of victimization, you must determine the most appropriate category in which to report the victim. So I'm going to jump ahead to question 33 because it relates so closely to question 29. So in question 33, you indicate reasons for partial service or for victim survivors not being able to be served. We have in this question a column where you can indicate partial service, and then a column for those who are not served. So here you would indicate those reasons. You would check all that apply. Please know that typically the use of other almost always indicates the victim survivor should have been reclassified or should not have been counted in this section at all. I have a few common reporting areas and errors in the other category that I'm going to walk through, as they typically show a misunderstanding. So one of the big ones that we see is victims did not return. If your program began to provide a victim with the grant-funded service they requested, and the victim does not return, the victim withdraws, or the victim relocates, you would count this person as served even if the service was not completed. If the program did not take any action to remove them and the victim removed themselves, they should be counted as served. And this is because they are essentially no longer requesting that service, and you were able to provide that service to them while they were requesting it. Another common one is victim refused services. If a program offers services, usually through outreach, and the victim refuses those services, excuse me, or does not contact you to accept services, you would not count them in this section. Only if, because of outreach activities, they request or accept a grant-funded service, would they be counted in this section. For instance, if you called a victim and told them about all of the services that your program provides and they declined services, you would not count this person at all in this section. However, if you called and the victim requested and received counseling because of your call, you would count them as served in the victim services section. Another common statement reported another is service was not provided by our program. You should only factor in services supported with grant funds. For example, your rural grant funds only support crisis intervention services. A victim contacts your program seeking crisis intervention and a support group. You should only consider your program's ability to provide the crisis intervention when determining if the victim should be counted as served, partially served, or not served. And then lastly, could not locate victim. So if your program began to provide the requested services, this person would be counted as served. However, if this person was placed on a wait list, and when your program was able to provide that service, you were unable to locate the victim, you would count this victim as not served. Most likely, you would then indicate program reach capacity in question 33 because your program was not able to provide service when it was requested. I have a few examples that I'm going to walk through to hopefully help you think through how to report in these questions. So, example number 1, your rural grant funds crisis intervention and transportation. A victim of domestic violence requests crisis intervention and transportation. You provide crisis intervention, but do not provide transportation because your office is closed during the time the transportation is requested. In this case, the victim received only some of the services they requested, and you are funded to provide under your grant. The victim should be reported as partially served under domestic violence in question 29, and then in question 30, you would indicate hours of operation and partially served to explain why that individual was partially served. Example number 2. A survivor of sexual assault requested counseling at the beginning of the reporting period. And then the same survivor came back at the end of the reporting period and requested legal advocacy. You are able to provide both the grant-funded services. So in this case, the survivor would be reported as served in the sexual assault column. Additionally, although this person requested 2 services at different times for 2 different services, you should still count them only once in question 29 as it is an unduplicated count. Example number 3. Your program offers counseling and legal advocacy. A victim of stalking requests these 2 grant-funded services, and you are unable to provide either because your program is filled to capacity. You would report this victim as not served in question 29 under the stalking column because you are not able to provide either grant-funded services. You would then also check off the reason of program reach capacity in question 33 under the not served column to indicate the reason why. And then for my last example, your rural program fund support group and counseling services. A survivor of sexual assault comes to your office and requests transportation and legal accompaniment, which you are able to provide through other funding. Since the survivor only requested services you are not funded to provide under your rural grant, you would not report the individual on this form. Even though you provided the services requested, they were not provided under the grant and should not be included on the report. Hopefully those examples were helpful to you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question in this section, which is question number 30, where you report the number of new victim survivors served or partially served during the current reporting period. So if this is your first time using rural program funds to provide victim services, then all the victim survivors reported in question 29A and B should be reported as new in question 30. If the victim survivor has been counted as served or partially served in a previous reporting period, do not include them here, even if that victim survivor sought services for a new victimization. So for example, if you provided services to a domestic violence victim during the previous reporting period, and that victim returned during the current reporting period after being sexually assaulted, you would not count them in this question, and instead you would report the additional victimization in question 31. So moving on to question 31, that is where you report the number of victim survivors served for all types of victimizations. So report any additional types of victimizations for which a victim survivor received rural program funded services during the current reporting period. Report in the row that corresponds to the victimization you reported that victim in question 29A and B, and report the victim survivor only once under each category. I also want to note that because of VAWA 2013, rural grantees are now allowed to provide services for trafficking victims as long as those victim survivors are also receiving rural funded services for the victimizations of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, or child sexual abuse. So in this question is where you can indicate that additional victimization. I also want to note that the table will automatically populate the number of victim survivors served and partially served under each presenting victimization that was reported in question 29A and B. So for instance, you can see from my previous example where one partially served domestic violence victim was reported, that this question automatically populated a 1 in the presenting victimization of domestic violence, dating violence, and the additional victimization of domestic violence, dating violence. As you can see, it also auto-populated the sexual assault category from question 29. Moving right along, question number 32, number of secondary victims served. So you would report the number of secondary victims served here, who were served with rural program funds. And this should be an unduplicated count in one of the listed categories and should correspond to the victimization of the victim survivor reported in question number 29. Secondary victims are those who are indirectly affected by the domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or child sexual abuse, and may include children, siblings, spouses, or intimate partners, grandparents, other affected family members, friends, and neighbors. So you provide that information in 32. And then we already went over question 33, which brings us to question 34, demographics of victims, survivors served or partially served. So here you would report the demographic information of those victim survivors reported in question 29A and B. Under the race and ethnicity category, you would report in each field that's appropriate. So the total should equal or be higher than the sum of 29A and B, served and partially served. The victim survivors may be reported in multiple race and ethnicity categories, so it's okay that the total would be greater than the unduplicated count of individuals. For both the gender and the age categories, the total should equal exactly the sum of question 29A and B. And so you'll have a little reminder next to the total where it says should equal blank, the sum of 29A and B. So this field should equal that number, as well as this total should equal that number. And then we have the other demographics box, and in this you would report to the best of your ability. The numbers reported here are only to the extent that you have learned incidentally through providing services. We are not requesting that you include questions about this demographic information on your intake forms or anything. This is just if you happen to learn about these demographics through providing services, would we then ask that you include it. For question number 35, report the victim survivor's relationship to offenders by type of victimization. If a victim survivor experienced more than one type of victimization and or was victimized by more than one perpetrator, you would count the victim survivor in all the categories that apply, and the total reported under each type of victimization should equal or be higher than the total of 29A and B under the same victimization. So say, for example, that you reported 50 sexual assault victim survivors as served and partially served in question 29, then there should be at least 50 relationships reported in this question under sexual assault. Also, if you don't know the victim survivor's relationship to the offender, you may absolutely use the relationship unknown category. As much as possible, report the information in these questions, but information gathering should not be a barrier to service provision. The next question is question 36A, victim services. And so based on the victim survivors reported in question 29A and B, report the number of victim survivors who received rural program-funded services during the current reporting period. Count each victim survivor only once for each type of service that the victim survivor received during the current reporting period under the column that is titled Number of Victim Survivors. And you may count them in each reporting period that they received services. And then you would report the number of times each grant-funded service was provided in the next column titled Number of Times Service Was Provided. If the only service provided was an intake, this victim should not be counted at all because it is unlikely the victim requested an intake. The intake is a procedure used by the agency, not a service which a victim typically requests. If you use the other category, please be very specific. Please do not use acronyms or abbreviations. To note, some acceptable responses in the other category would be relocation expenses or supervised visitation. The next question, 36B, shelter services. For this question, you would report the total number of victim survivors and accompanying family members who received emergency shelter or transitional housing provided with rural program funds during the current reporting period. And this should be an unduplicated count of both victim survivors and family members. This means that each victim survivor and each family member who received shelter services during the current reporting period should be counted only once. Emergency shelter can be safe houses and/or hotel or motel accommodations, and report the total number of bed nights provided in emergency shelter or transitional housing to victim survivors and family members. The number of bed nights is determined by multiplying the number of victims and family members by the number of nights each stayed in the shelter. The number of bed nights will typically be significantly higher than the number of victim survivors and family members. So say, for example, 10 domestic violence victim survivors stayed in the emergency shelter for 5 days each, and each was accompanied by 3 family members who also stayed for 5 nights each. This would be reported as 10 victim survivors, 30 family members, for a total of 200 bed nights in the emergency shelter row. Question 37, hotline support information and referral. This is where you report the number of hotline requests received for victim survivors and the total number of hotline requests that were responded to by rural program funded staff or with rural program funds. Requests reported here should not be reported as victim survivors served in question 29 unless they also received at least one of the services listed in question 36A, victim services, or 36B, shelter services. Victim survivors who receive services such as crisis intervention or victim advocacy in addition to basic hotline information and or referrals should also be reported in question 36A. For question 38, victim witness notification, outreach to victim survivors, report the number of unsolicited letters, phone calls, or visits you provided to victim survivors. Only victim survivors who responded to your contact and received additional grant-funded services listed in question 36A should be reported in question 29A or B. And then in question 39, protection orders, you report the total number of requests received by the authority with power to grant a protection order for temporary and final protection orders and the total number of each granted by type of victimization. Section B, legal services. So you would only provide answers to this subsection if rural program funds supported an attorney and or paralegal who provided legal services to victim survivors during the current reporting period. So if that situation does not apply to you, go ahead and click no and move on to question 44. If you did use rural program funds to support an attorney or paralegal who provided legal services, go ahead and click yes and answer questions 43 through 44, or 40 through 43, sorry. So question 40 is where you report legal issues, and here you report the total number of legal issues addressed by rural program funded attorneys or paralegals during the current reporting period. You count a victim or survivor once in each category of legal issue for which they received assistance. For the general category B, family law matters, as well as category G, immigration matters, you would provide an unduplicated count of victim survivors who received assistance in one or more of the subcategories listed under each of those general categories. And then you would report the number of victim survivors who received assistance with each of the subcategories. So this general category here is not intended to be a total of the subcategories. It is intended to be an unduplicated count of the victim survivors who received assistance with any of the subcategories. The next question is question number 41. So this is where you report the number of victim survivors who received assistance with legal issues in question 40. You would report an unduplicated count of victim survivors who received assistance with at least one legal issue in question 40. If they received assistance with more than one legal issue, count them only once in this question, and then you would report them below in question 42. Question 42 is the number of victim survivors who received assistance with multiple legal issues. So you report the number of victim survivors who received assistance with multiple legal issues, which would be receiving assistance with more than one of the categories, so A through J, listed in question 40 during the current reporting period. For purposes of this question, you should consider all family law matters, section B, as one category, and all immigration matters, section G, as one category. So for example, if a victim receives assistance with a divorce and child support only, do not count that victim in question 42 since both are listed under category B. However, if a victim receives assistance with divorce and a housing issue, you would go ahead and count them in question 42 as receiving assistance with multiple issues. And then the next question is question 43, and that this is used to report legal outcomes for cases that were closed or for specific issues or matters that were resolved during the current reporting period. We would report here only on the outcomes of cases in which services were provided by rural-funded attorneys or paralegals. You would not report in this question, for example, if a legal advocate assisted a victim with filling out the paperwork of an ex parte protection order. However, if an attorney or a paralegal working under the supervision of an attorney provided similar assistance, you would count them here. Report only the highest level of service or outcome achieved for each issue, and report the outcomes for all issues. We strongly advise that you read through the definitions of these outcome categories in the separate instructions. And then question 44 is the optional additional information question for the victim services and legal services question. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to the start of the legal services section and walk through a couple examples with you of how to report in these questions or in specific questions. Say, for example, during the current reporting period, 2 victims of domestic violence requested assistance with divorcing their abusive spouses. In one case, your rural-funded attorney filed a divorce complaint with no other issues. In the other case, the attorney filed a divorce complaint and also obtained temporary family court orders addressing custody visitation and child support. In this case, you would report 2 in the general category B of family law matters, and then in the subcategories, you would report 2 in divorce, and then 1 in custody visitation, as well as 1 in child spousal support. For my second example, let's say you provide information and advice to assist someone with obtaining an emergency protection order on their behalf. And then later, you represent that same person at a contested court hearing in which they obtain a final order. In this case, you would report this victim once in the protection order category in question 40, legal issues, and then in question 43, you would report in both the information referral advice only category as well as court decision. The reason is that the temporary order and the final order each have independent legal outcomes, and they are not always joined together. So section E is the criminal justice system, and the first section within section E is section E1, law enforcement. So if your rural program funds were used for law enforcement, you would go ahead and click yes and answer questions 45 through 48. If your rural program funds were not used for law enforcement, you would check no and skip on to section E2. And here are a few tips about reporting in the law enforcement section. If you have an advocate employed by or located at the law enforcement agency, but rural grant funds are not supporting the law enforcement activities, you would not complete the section, but rather would report activities in section D, victim services. However, if you are funding a prosecution-based investigator, you would report their activities here. In question 45, you would report the number of law enforcement activities related to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and or child sexual abuse cases and incidents for the current reporting period. If an activity relates to a case or incident involving more than one type of crime, the activity should be counted only once under the primary victimization. For question 46, you report the total number of victim survivor referrals made by rural program-funded law enforcement officers to victim services, governmental and non-governmental. These referral numbers are not unduplicated, since a victim survivor could receive a referral to both. For question 47, you would report the total number of temporary and/or final protection orders requested and granted, and protection orders should be reported only if law enforcement provided assistance to victim survivors in requesting or obtaining them. Question 48 is the optional additional information question, and you may provide any additional information you would like to. Section E2, Prosecution. So if your rural program funds were used to support prosecution activities during the current reporting period, you would answer yes and answer questions 49 through 54. And if not, you would check no and skip on to section E3. But if you did, here are a few tips for you in completing the prosecution section. So it's important to know that all data reported in the prosecution section is based on cases rather than charges. And if you have an advocate employed by or located at the prosecutor's office, but rural grant funds are not supporting the prosecution activities, you would not complete this section, but would report activities in Section D, Victim Services. So for question 49A, you report the number of case referrals received, the number of cases accepted for prosecution, the number of cases declined, and the number of cases transferred to higher or lower court outside of grant-funded jurisdictions. Case referrals received should be based on those referrals received from law enforcement. Some jurisdictions receive referrals from other sources, and you can include those referrals if you have that information. The numbers reported in 49 B, C, and D should be related to the number reported in 49A, case referrals. There may be exceptions, such as if a case referral was received during the previous reporting period, but nothing happened until the current reporting period. For 49B, reasons for declining cases, you would report only the primary reason for declining the case reported in 49AC, reporting by type of crime. If you find you are using other, please be very specific. Most reasons for declining cases should fit into the existing categories. Only tribal grantees should complete question 49C. If you are a tribal grantee, you should report the number of felony, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse cases referred for state and federal prosecution during the current reporting period. If you are not a tribal grantee, do not complete this question. For question 50, report the dispositions of those cases resolved during the current reporting period by type of case and disposition. If a case is not resolved yet, you do not need to report anything. For question 51, other issues, discuss the extent to which cases that were characterized as domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse also included additional charges or elements of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse. For question 52, report the number of victim survivors you have referred to victim services, both governmental and non-governmental. 53, specify whether protection orders, temporary or final, for which victim survivors received assistance from grant-funded prosecution personnel were for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse crimes. You should answer this question only if prosecutors assisted with protection orders. Typically, if a grantee reports the number of protection orders requested, we expect to see data reported on the number granted and vice versa. Question 54 is an optional additional information narrative question. Section E3, courts. If your rural program funds were used for courts, check yes and answer questions 55 through 61. If your rural program funds were not used for courts, check no and skip on to section E4. Some tips for filling out the court section. All data reported in the court section is based on cases rather than charges. And if you have an advocate employed by or located at the court, but rural grant funds are not supporting the court activities, you would not complete this section, but would report activities in section D, victim services. So cases should be categorized by the most serious offense, and it may include numerous charges or counts. In most instances, a case will refer to one victim, one offender, and one incident. Domestic violence cases should be reported as DV regardless of the actual charge, so assault, vandalism, criminal threatening, etc. And sexual assault cases could include rape, gross sexual misconduct, etc. So the moral of the story is that they don't have to be specifically labeled as domestic violence or sexual assault cases, but just knowing that typically sexual battery and harassment fall underneath sexual assault, and that criminal threatening and assault or vandalism can fall under domestic violence instances. You should then include them in the appropriate categories. In question number 55, you would report the dispositions of criminal cases resolved during the current reporting period. In question 56, judicial monitoring, you report judicial monitoring activities supported with grant funds. In the first column, you would report the number of offenders reviewed, and then in the second column, you would report the number of review hearings conducted. This should be the number of individual review hearings. So for example, if your court holds review hearings on the second Tuesday of the month, you would count all review hearings held that day if they were supported with rural funds. You would not count the entire day of hearings as one hearing. For question 57, dispositions of violations, report the number of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. The violation does not need to occur during the current reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. For question 58, report the number of victim survivors that court personnel have referred to victim services, both governmental and non-governmental. For 59, specify whether civil protection orders by the court were for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and/or child sexual abuse victims. You should report the number of temporary and final civil protection orders requested and granted by the court. For question 60, criminal protection orders, report the number of criminal protection orders requested and granted by the court during the current reporting period. And then question number 61 is for additional information, and it's optional. And so you may discuss the effectiveness of grant activities funded or supported by your rural program grant, and you could provide any additional information you would like to share about those activities beyond what is provided in the data, if you would like to. Section E4, probation and parole. So if your rural program funds were used for probation and parole, you would check yes and answer questions 62 through 66. And if your rural program funds were not used for probation and parole, you would check no and skip forward to section E5. For question 62, number of offenders, in the first column, you would report the total number of offenders for domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and child sexual abuse. In the second and third columns, you would report the number of offenders who completed probation activities without violations and the number completing probation with violations. The total number completing probation both with and without violations, should not be higher than the total number of offenders. In question 63, you would report the monitoring activities by probation and parole funded staff. The first column identifies the type of contact. The second column identifies the number of offenders or victim survivors. And the third column identifies the total number of contacts. For number 64, dispositions of violations, you report the number of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and or child sexual abuse cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. The violation does not need to occur during the current reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. For question 65, you would report the number of victim survivors referred to victim services, governmental and non-governmental, by grant-funded probation and parole staff. And then question number 66 is another optional additional information question. Section E5, Batterer Intervention Program. If rural program funds were used for Batterer intervention programs, check yes and answer questions 67 through 69. If not, check no and skip on to section F. For question 67, offenders in program, you report the number of offenders in your grant-funded Batterer intervention programs during the current reporting period. In question 68, report the outcomes for the offenders who completed grant-funded Batterer intervention programs, who were terminated from the program, or who returned to the program after termination during the current reporting period. Termination can be by the program or by the offender. If you need to use other, please be as specific as possible. In question 69, length of Batterer intervention program in weeks, report the number of weeks that batterers are expected to remain in the program in order to complete it. If your program has more than one program length and or curriculum, provide the length for each type of program supported with grant funds. Section F, narrative. So in this section, all grantees must answer question number 70. And in question 70, you report on the status of all of your rural program grant goals and objectives as of the end of the current reporting period. Report only on the status of your approved goals and objectives. All of these must be reported in each reporting period. Your OVW program manager will pay close attention to this question, as this question enables them to monitor the status of your grant goals and objectives. You would indicate whether the activities related to your objectives for the reporting period have been completed, are in progress, are delayed, or have been revised. And that question looks like this. For questions 71 and 72, all grantees must complete these two questions during the January to June report. So for question 71, what do you see as the most significant areas of remaining need with regard to improving services to victim survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and child sexual abuse, increasing victim survivor safety, and enhancing community response, including offender accountability for both batterers and sex offenders? You should report not only on the needs of your program, but needs within the community, needs of victim survivors, underserved populations, challenges, and barriers. The next question is question 72, which again is required during the January to June report, and that's asking, what has the rural program funding allowed you to do that you could not do prior to receiving this funding? So in this question, please be as specific as possible. If you have any information about what it was like before receiving rural program funding that you can compare with results that occurred after receiving rural funding, we would really like to know about it. We can use stories and statistics that you provide when we write reports for OVW. Then the next two questions, questions 73 and 74, are always optional. For question 73, you would just provide additional information regarding the effectiveness of your grant-funded program. And then in question 74, provide any additional information that you would like us to know about the data submitted. If there were any issues or irregularities in the data you reported in previous sections of the form, provide explanations here that will help us understand the data in this question. For example, if your computer crashed and you lost data, or if a person that you hired left during the current reporting period so you could not provide certain data, let us know that. We here at VAWA MEI look at this question before we look at any other part of your report. So once you've filled everything out and the form is completed, you must go to the very last page and click the Validate button here. The validation process will highlight any missing or incomplete information and ask whether you wish to return to the section to review or change the data. When this happens, you may see one of two warning messages. So one type is with that red X, which is on the furthest left on the slide. If you receive this type of message, it means you are missing some of the required information. If you want to fix this error, go ahead and click Yes, and it will bring you back to that question, the exact question on the form, so that you can fix it. If you don't want to, go ahead and click No, and you can continue with the validation. It is really important to note, though, that you will not be able to complete the validation process until you fix a validation error that comes up with that red X. The second type of warning is a reminder with a yellow exclamation point, so here. This type of message indicates that something on the form looks like it may be incorrect. If you do not have to make a correction to the form to successfully validate it, you do not have to make a correction to the form to successfully validate it when this error occurs. If you want to review the field, click Yes, and it will bring you back to that exact question on the form. But if not, go ahead and click No and continue with the validation process. After correcting or completing missing information, return to the bottom of the form and press Validate. You will receive a third warning message, which is not really a warning at all, which is this one. It's telling you actually that the validation process is a success and that you're completed filling out and validating your form. At this point, your form has been successfully validated and it is ready for you to submit through GMS. So that's the entire form and the reporting process. What I have here on the slide now is the resources available to you through our website. So that's our website, and on there you can watch this closed captioning recording for the entire progress report training, section by section, not only for the rural program, but for all of the other programs. You can download training materials, you can download sample progress reporting forms and instructions. We have a frequently asked questions document that you can access and download. You can review summary data reports or the reports to Congress, as well as find contact information for us if you have any specific questions. I would like to say thank you for accessing this recording, and I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions as you were filling out the reporting form, please feel free to call or email Muskie's VAWA MEI, your program specialist, or GMS. All of those resources are provided here on the slide for you. Again, I will advocate for you to reach out to VAWA MEI if you have any questions about the reporting form or reporting process. That's what we're here for, and we're really happy to help in any way that we can. Thank you again, and happy reporting.